if you served in Vietnam, or if you know someone who did, this video is going to hit close to home. Because today, we're talking about the fears that define that war. Not the sanitized version you see in most documentaries, but the real, visceral threats that kept soldiers awake at night in those jungles. I've spent years researching veteran testimonies, military records, and first-hand accounts from men who served in Vietnam. And what I found was that beyond the obvious dangers of combat, there were specific terrors that haunted American soldiers in ways that other wars hadn't prepared them for. This wasn't like World War II or Korea. The Vietnam War introduced a new kind of psychological warfare, where the jungle itself became the enemy, and death could come from anywhere or nowhere at any moment. So today, I'm breaking down the 5 greatest fears that Vietnam veterans have consistently identified in interviews, memoirs, and military psychological studies. These are the things that made the Vietnam experience uniquely terrifying. Let's start with what veterans consistently rank as one of their most persistent fears: booby traps. According to military records, booby traps accounted for approximately 11% of American casualties in Vietnam, but their psychological impact was far greater than those numbers suggest. Why? Because they turned every single step into a potential death sentence. Punji stakes were among the most feared. These were sharpened bamboo stakes, often dipped in feces or other contaminants to cause infection, hidden in camouflaged pits along trails. Veterans describe the constant paranoia of watching where you stepped, knowing that one moment of distraction could mean your foot impaled on a stake covered in excrement. But punji stakes weren't even the worst of it. Grenade traps were everywhere. In veteran testimonies, soldiers described the metallic tink sound of accidentally triggering one. That split second where you knew something was about to explode, but you didn't know if you had time to react. Whip traps used tension from bent bamboo to swing spiked boards into soldiers' faces or chests. One veteran described it in an oral history. You'd be walking point, focused on what's ahead, and suddenly there's this whoosh sound and a board full of spikes coming at you from the side. The psychological toll was immense. Veterans report that the constant vigilance required, scanning every inch of ground, every overhanging branch, every suspicious disturbance in the trail, created an exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. It was mental warfare, and it never stopped. Even decades later, many Vietnam veterans described difficulty with walking in wooded areas or reflexively watching the ground for disturbances, a hypervigilance that was trained into them by months or years of navigating booby trap terrain. Now let's talk about a specific type of mine that deserves its own category of terror: the Bouncing Betty. The M16 mine, nicknamed Bouncing Betty. The mechanism was diabolically simple and horrifyingly effective. When triggered, the mine would launch approximately 3 feet into the air before detonating at chest or face height, sending shrapnel in a 360-degree radius. The kill radius was about 30 feet, with the injury radius extending much further. Veterans described the distinctive click when someone stepped on one. That sound meant someone had just triggered the mine. In multiple veteran testimonies, soldiers describe the impossible moral calculus of that moment. Do you run toward your buddy to try to help, knowing you might get caught in the blast? Do you dive for cover? There's no right answer, and that split-second decision haunted many who survived such incidents. What made Bouncing Betties particularly terrifying was their unpredictability. According to military engineers' reports, they could be buried in trails, hidden in abandoned equipment, placed in doorways of villages, or positioned anywhere soldiers might walk. One Marine veteran, in a recorded interview from the Vietnam Archive at Texas Tech University, stated, "Every time you took a step, there was this voice in your head asking if this was the one. This step, this one right here. You couldn't shut it off." The psychological impact of this constant threat shows up in PTSD studies of Vietnam veterans. The hyperstartle response, jumping at sudden noises, that many veterans experience decades later is directly linked to months or years of anticipating that explosive blast that could come at any moment. The third fear is perhaps the most psychologically complex: the invisible enemy. The North Vietnamese army perfected a style of warfare that was completely foreign to American soldiers trained in conventional combat. They could appear from nowhere, attack, and disappear back into the jungle like ghosts. Spider holes and tunnel systems were a major part of this. According to military intelligence reports, the Siuchi tunnels alone covered over 150 miles. Soldiers could be standing on top of an enemy position and have no idea. Veterans describe the surreal experience of being fired upon, returning fire, and then finding nothing but jungle when they advanced, until someone noticed the camouflage trapdoor in the ground. The tunnels weren't just for hiding. They were complete underground bases with sleeping quarters, hospitals, and storage facilities. The enemy could quite literally vanish into the earth. Tree snipers added another dimension to this fear. They were so well camouflaged that soldiers could walk directly underneath them without seeing them. Multiple veterans described the experience of someone in their unit being shot, everyone hitting the ground and searching for the shooter, and finding nothing, just thick jungle. One particularly haunting aspect of this invisible warfare was that civilians could be combatants. Veterans described the impossible position this put them in. A woman working in a rice paddy during the day might plant a booby trap at night. A child might be used to scout American positions. This created a constant state of distrust that wore soldiers down psychologically. As one Army veteran stated in a documented interview, "You couldn't trust anything you saw. The kid selling you a Coke might be reporting your position. The village that seemed peaceful might have weapons caches buried under every home." You learn to trust nothing and no one. The long-term psychological impact of this type of warfare appears repeatedly in veteran accounts. The inability to identify friend from foe, to know where the enemy was, or to feel safe even in supposedly secured areas created a persistent anxiety that many veterans report still experiencing. The fourth fear centers on a specific tactical nightmare: ambushes in confined jungle spaces. The jungle terrain of Vietnam gave the NVA enormous advantages in setting up kill zones. Unlike open terrain where soldiers could maneuver, the thick jungle vegetation often channeled American units into narrow trails, streams, or clearings where they became perfect targets. The classic L-shaped ambush was particularly devastating. The first indication of an ambush would be sudden, overwhelming gunfire from multiple directions simultaneously. Veterans describe the sensory overload of these moments, the immediate confusion of not knowing where fire is coming from, the difficulty of returning fire when you can't identify targets in thick vegetation, the chaos of soldiers trying to maneuver in dense jungle while under fire, and the speed with which casualties could mount. What made these ambushes particularly terrifying was the preparation the enemy put into them. They would clear fields of fire for themselves while leaving the American side thick with vegetation. They would position claymore mines and machine guns at key points. They would plot escape routes that allowed them to break contact and disappear within minutes. The term breaking contact appears frequently in veteran accounts of ambushes. The enemy would hit hard, inflict maximum casualties, and then vanish before American firepower and air support could be effectively brought to bear. This meant soldiers often couldn't even see who they were fighting. One particularly feared tactic was the baited ambush. The enemy would leave one or two soldiers visible to draw American forces into pursuit, leading them directly into a prepared kill zone where the main force waited. Helicopter insertion zones, LZs, were another ambush nightmare. Veterans described the vulnerability of exiting a helicopter into what could be a hot LZ, dropping into a confined space while under fire with limited cover. The psychological impact of this type of combat was profound. Every patrol into the jungle carried the knowledge that at any moment, overwhelming fire could erupt from the vegetation around you. Many veterans describe a constant, grinding anxiety that came from never feeling safe outside a base, and sometimes not even there. The fifth fear is one that became more understood over time: chemical warfare and environmental contamination, particularly Agent Orange. During the war, the U.S. military sprayed approximately 20 million gallons of herbicides over Vietnam, with Agent Orange being the most widely used. The stated purpose was defoliation, removing jungle cover that the enemy used for concealment and destroying crops that might feed enemy forces. But soldiers on the ground had a more immediate fear. What was this stuff doing to them? Veterans describe seeing areas sprayed with Agent Orange, watching the jungle die and turn brown within days. They described the smell, the way it settled on their skin and equipment, the way it contaminated water sources. And they described being told it was safe, even as they wondered about the oily residue on their hands and the chemical taste in their mouths. Beyond Agent Orange, soldiers feared other forms of chemical and environmental warfare. There were reports, some confirmed, others rumored, of contaminated water supplies, poisoned food, and other forms of environmental warfare. The monsoon season added another environmental fear. Heavy rains turned the ground into mud, made movement difficult, caused weapons to malfunction, and created conditions for tropical diseases. Soldiers describe trying to stay dry being a losing battle and the constant dampness leading to jungle rot, immersion foot, and various infections. Malaria, dengue fever, and other tropical diseases were a constant threat. According to military medical records, disease and non-battle injuries actually exceeded combat casualties at certain points in the war. Veterans describe the fear of waking up with fever, knowing that malaria could kill you just as surely as a bullet. But it was Agent Orange that became the lasting fear, one that extended beyond the war itself. In the decades following Vietnam, veterans began experiencing cancers, neurological disorders, and other serious health conditions. Their children showed elevated rates of birth defects. The fear that was initially about immediate danger became a fear of what had been done to their bodies without their knowledge or consent. One veteran, interviewed for a documentary years after the war, stated, "In combat, you know who the enemy is and what might kill you. With Agent Orange, we were being poisoned by our own side, and we didn't even know it was happening." These 5 fears, booby traps, bouncing Betty mines, the invisible enemy, jungle ambushes, and chemical contamination, define the Vietnam War experience in ways that made it psychologically distinct from other American conflicts. What united these fears was a common thread: the feeling of helplessness. Unlike conventional warfare, where soldiers could identify threats and take action against them, Vietnam presented dangers that were often invisible, unpredictable, and unavoidable. The booby trap might be in the next step, but there was no way to be completely certain. The mine might be anywhere, but you had to keep walking. The enemy might be watching right now, but you couldn't see them. The ambush might come at any moment, but you still had to go on patrol. The chemicals being sprayed might be harming you, but orders were orders. This created a unique psychological burden that appears consistently in veteran accounts, PTSD studies, and military psychiatric research from the era. The inability to take effective action against threats, combined with the constant nature of the danger, created a stress that many veterans describe as different from the acute fear of conventional combat. Decades after the war, these fears still resonate. Veterans still describe watching where they step in wooded areas. They still startle at sudden loud noises. They still feel uncomfortable when they can't see what's around them. And they still deal with the health consequences of environmental exposures that happened 50 years ago. Understanding these fears is crucial to understanding the Vietnam War experience and the particular challenges faced by veterans of that conflict. It's not just about honoring their service. It's about recognizing the specific psychological and physical burdens they carried, both during the war and in the decades since. If you're a Vietnam veteran, I'd like to hear from you in the comments. Which of these fears resonates most with your experience? Were there other fears I didn't cover that were equally significant? For everyone else, if you know a Vietnam veteran, take a moment to understand that their experiences included these kinds of daily, grinding fears that went far beyond conventional combat. That understanding can make a real difference. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe if you found this educational, and check out the sources I've linked in the description below for further reading on the Vietnam War experience.